Soviet cosmonaut returned after 7 hours. But according to the documents, he was missing for 11 months. The step around Baikonur holds its silence the way metal holds cold, deeply, stubbornly, without compromise. In the hours before dawn, when the horizon is a thin iron line and the frost has not yet begun to melt on the concrete slabs, the cosmonautics facility seems less like a place built by human hands and more like an exposed nerve of the state, lying bare beneath the colorless sky. The air tastes faintly of kerosene and something more primitive, something metallic and granular that the wind lifts from the ground and presses into the seams of clothing and the corners of buildings. Long shadows fall from the skeletal frames of antennas that turn their faces slowly, endlessly, toward the sky, as if listening for something no one has taught them to understand. In this half-light, the barracks appear hunched and wary, their plaster walls cracked in places where winter has pushed too hard, their roofs dented by time and the ceaseless wind that drags its fingers along the perimeter fence. Even the hangars seem to exhale their own history. Warm fumes from old engines, the muffled hum of electrical panels that were installed 2 decades ago and have not been replaced, the faint scent of oil soaks so deeply into the floor that it has become part of the building's identity. The late 1960s live here not as dates in a newspaper but as a pressure in the air, a rigidity in the posture of the men who walk these corridors, a relentless awareness that the world beyond is measuring them, timing them, watching the race between nations as if it were a contest of faith rather than technology. Inside the control rooms, green-shaded lamps cast narrow pools of light over maps, charts, telemetry sheets, and the permanent film of cigarette smoke that never fully disperses, even when the windows are cracked open to let in the freezing air. Everything smells of paper and electricity. The equipment, some new, some outdated, sits in rows of metal cabinets with small glass windows through which bulbs flicker like uncertain stars. Technicians move between them in careful, precise steps, their expressions taut with the confidence expected of them and the caution learned from long nights spent correcting unpredictable machinery. Conversations are brief and clipped, always half a sentence away from secrecy, because at Baikonur one never speaks too loudly, not even when discussing routine details. The corridors outside are narrow, lit by weak overhead bulbs that hum with the fatigue of constant use, and the walls carry marks from boots, gloves, and crates that have been dragged through over the years. Voices travel strangely here, softened by the thick concrete. Sometimes one hears the murmur of distant discussions without knowing who is speaking or what is being said. The entire facility feels built not to welcome life but to contain it, to discipline it, to prepare it for departure into vacuum. It is in this environment that the cosmonaut appears each morning, moving through the cold like someone accustomed to greeting the day without expecting it to greet him back. He is neither tall nor imposing, yet there is something in the way he carries himself, shoulder squared, gaze steady, steps purposeful, that suggests he has learned to live in anticipation of weight, of responsibility, of the unspoken expectations that cling to those chosen for missions that will never be fully explained to them. His uniform is always impeccably maintained, though the fabric at the elbows has begun to thin. When he enters a room, conversations often soften but never stop entirely. Instead they adjust themselves around him, adopting a slightly different tone, as if everyone is conscious that he lives closer to risk than they do. He speaks politely but briefly, and his silences linger longer than his words. He has the habit of pausing by windows, not to look at anything in particular, but as if listening for something behind the glass. When he reviews checklists, his fingers trace the edges of the paper with an almost reverent focus, though no one can say whether this is discipline or an attempt to ground himself in the familiar. There is a tiredness in his posture that does not come from lack of sleep, but from the long, quiet process of preparing one's mind for the possibility of not returning from above. Around him, the secondary figures of this world begin to form like constellations. The mission control operators whose eyes are reddened from nights spent watching telemetry streams, the military supervisors whose boots echo sharply in the corridors and whose presence makes the air feel heavier, the medical officers who speak softly but observe with clinical accuracy, and the archive clerks who move through the facility like shadows carrying folders bound with twine, always careful not to meet anyone's gaze for too long. They form the invisible geometry of Baikonur, a network of roles and responsibilities held together by unspoken rules and shared obligations. When they interact with the cosmonaut, they do so with a mixture of respect and distance, as though acknowledging his proximity to something sacred and dangerous. Their gestures are restrained, their words chosen with care. A technician handing him a document avoids touching his hand. A doctor listening to his heartbeat counts the seconds too slowly. A supervisor asking a question waits too long before writing down the answer. These small hesitations, barely perceptible, accumulate into a rhythm that suggests not uncertainty, but unease. Outside, the natural world presses itself against the facility as if attempting to reclaim the land. The steppe wind drags long strands of dust across the concrete, whispering against metal pipes and rattling loose panels with a persistence that makes the building seem restless. The sky is vast and pale, a dome of washed-out blue that feels almost artificial, too uniform to be trusted. Birds rarely fly overhead. When they do, their silhouettes appear fragile and lost against the emptiness. The smell of cold soil mixes with the scent of machinery, creating an atmosphere that feels both raw and industrial. When the sun rises fully, its light reveals the imperfections of every surface, rust blooming like moss on railings, faded paint peeling away to expose the bare metal beneath, cracks in the pavement widened by the freeze-thaw cycle until they resemble thin, dark paths leading nowhere. In the distance, old structures groan as the temperature shifts, their beams expanding and contracting with a sound like restrained breathing. Even the launch pads, those monuments of ambition, stand with a tired posture, their scaffolding creaking faintly as if protesting the cold. As the day progresses, the cosmonaut moves from room to room, from simulation to briefing, from medical examination to equipment check, each task carried out with the same measured diligence. Yet beneath this routine there is a tension in the air, a pressure that no one acknowledges openly. Operators exchange glances when they think no one is watching. A supervisor closes a folder the moment he sees the cosmonaut approaching. A clerk pauses before signing a document, as though reconsidering the meaning of the date. These small moments dissolve quickly, but they leave behind traces, as if the entire facility is trying to maintain the facade of normalcy while hiding something just beneath the surface. Even the cosmonaut feels it, though he does not name it, in the way his breath catches slightly when entering a room filled with equipment he has seen 1,000 times, or in the way he hesitates before giving a routine confirmation to mission control. His reflection in the glass panels of the control room seems thinner than usual, as if time is already beginning to slip around him. By late afternoon the atmosphere grows heavier. The sun sinks low, casting long bars of orange light across the concrete and turning the edges of metal structures into thin lines of fire. Shadows stretch across the ground like the memory of something older than the facility itself. Inside, the corridors darken early, and the hum of machinery becomes more noticeable, vibrating faintly in the floors and walls. The air carries the faint smell of ozone from the electrical systems, mixed with the familiar sense of dust and aging equipment. People move more quietly now, as if the approach of evening requires a different kind of discipline, one shaped by the knowledge that night brings not rest but a deeper form of vigilance. In the control room, several operators linger longer than necessary, pretending to check equipment but really watching the cosmonaut as he reviews the final documents for the upcoming mission. Their eyes reveal something unspoken: concern, anticipation, perhaps fear. And then, in the quiet moments when no one is speaking and the only sound is the low hum of machinery settling into its nocturnal rhythm, the first faint pulse of contradiction seems to ripple through the atmosphere, a shift so subtle that no one could later point to its exact origin. A technician pauses mid-sentence, frowning at a timestamp on a piece of paper before hiding the confusion behind a neutral expression. A supervisor rereads a line in a report with an intensity that suggests he is searching for something he does not want to find. A doctor, after examining the cosmonaut, lingers a fraction too long before recording the result. These gestures dissipate quickly, swallowed by routine, but the impression remains. Something is wrong. Something has been wrong for longer than anyone dares to admit. It is as if the facility itself anticipates the anomaly, senses the dissonance between the 7 hours the cosmonaut will experience and the 11 months the documents will demand. The walls do not move, yet the air grows thicker. The lights do not flicker, yet the shadows seem to deepen. The routine continues, yet beneath it all lies an unnamed expectation, a quiet tremor waiting for its moment to be acknowledged. Even the wind outside seems to hesitate, as though listening. For what? No one can say. But the contradiction is already here, invisible and patient, settling into the cracks of the facility like dust. The days that followed the cosmonaut's initial briefings did not change in any visible way, yet everyone at the Baikonur facility felt an imperceptible shift, as if the air itself had thickened with something unspoken, something that pressed against the lungs with a faint metallic taste. Routines continued as expected. Morning inspections, mechanical checks, ration distributions, medical evaluations. But the rhythm with which they unfolded had acquired a barely noticeable distortion, like a record that plays at the correct speed yet contains a whispering undertone impossible to place. The technicians in the hangars still walked the same routes between consoles and access panels, but their conversations now trailed off at odd moments, leaving pockets of silence that lingered slightly too long before someone forced a return to procedural language. The cosmonaut observed these changes not through explicit behavior but through the temperature of the environment around him. Each corridor felt colder than it should be. Each metal handrail held a chill that seemed to persist even late in the day. Each step on the concrete produced a muted echo as though the building was swallowing sound out of caution. At night, the step winds grew more insistent, carrying dust that scratched faintly at the windows of the dormitories like brittle fingers drawing uncertain shapes. The lights in the hallways flickered with increasing hesitation before settling into steadiness, and even after stabilizing, a faint hum remained underneath the electrical current, as if the wiring itself had developed anxiety. When the cosmonaut walked from his barracks to the simulator building, he noticed that the shadows cast by the facility's antennas had begun to elongate strangely during certain hours, not in a way that defied physics, but in a way that suggested the light source itself was subtly faltering, a slight pulse of brightness and dimness that left objects looking older, more worn, more fragile than the day before. He tried to dismiss these impressions as fatigue, yet the feeling that the entire complex was quietly bracing for something persisted, and each morning it greeted him with the same low, resonant unease. During mission rehearsals, the tension deepened. The operators at the console banks still addressed him with the same formulaic politeness, but the cadence of their sentences had shifted, as though each man were weighing every word for reasons unrelated to technical accuracy. A flight engineer began a statement about orbital telemetry, paused mid-sentence, glanced briefly at the floor, then corrected himself with a different phrasing that changed nothing and yet somehow felt like a significant rearrangement of meaning. Another operator handed him a printout of routine checklists, but his fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though he were passing something dangerous, and when the cosmonaut looked at the document later, he found a small correction made in pencil, erased, rewritten, and erased again until only a faint, indecipherable indentation remained beneath the surface. These small inconsistencies accumulated like snowdrifts around the edges of daily procedure, forming subtle patterns that no one acknowledged openly, but that everyone seemed aware of in the darting glances exchanged during moments of unsupervised quiet. There were anomalies in the logs as well, though none explicit enough to file a formal report about. In the archive room, The clerks worked with their usual calm, stamping folders and writing dates with careful, narrow handwriting. Yet the cosmonaut noticed that on 3 separate occasions, the date on his mission prep documentation had been overwritten with a slightly different day and time. When he mentioned it softly to one of the clerks, the man froze for a beat, composed himself, and replied that an error in the cataloging system had caused brief duplication of entries, a harmless problem, already corrected. The explanation was reasonable, but the clerk's eyes moved in a precise, rehearsed pattern, down to the desk, to the left wall, then back to the folder, never once meeting the cosmonaut's face. Later, while leaving the room, the cosmonaut heard 2 clerks whispering behind a closed door. Their voices were too faint to decipher, but the rhythm of their exchange suggested disagreement. One voice speaking rapidly, the other interrupting with shorter, more cautious responses. When the door opened, both men emerged with perfect composure, nodding politely as if nothing had happened. The cosmonaut felt the contradiction growing not as a single revelation, but as a steady accretion of details that resisted coherence. His dreams began to change as well, not nightmares, exactly, but a strange looping quality that made each night feel half-lived and never quite completed. He would dream of walking down the central corridor of the main administrative building, but the walk would extend endlessly, the familiar doors stretching out in unnatural repetition. In the dream nothing frightening occurred, yet the emptiness within it pressed against him like a weight, and he would wake with the sense that he had left something unfinished behind him. The next day, when passing through that same corridor in waking life, he felt a prickling sensation along his arms, as if some faint residue of the dream still clung to the walls. The secondary personnel were not immune to the change. The medical officers maintained strict professionalism, but their interactions carried a subtle stiffness, as though they were measuring his responses not only for physiological data but for some more elusive sign. During a routine examination, one doctor asked him a question about sleep quality, then immediately rephrased it before the cosmonaut could answer, scribbling something in his notes that he partially covered with his hand. The cosmonaut noticed that the doctor's hand trembled just slightly, not with fear but with caution, the tremor of someone operating within constraints that he cannot name aloud. Another doctor, usually brisk and authoritative, now spoke more softly than usual, almost murmuring instructions under his breath as though the quietness itself were a protective measure. When the cosmonaut attempted to joke lightly about the excessive seriousness of the examinations, neither doctor reacted. Instead, both exchanged a quick, tight-lipped glance that signaled not annoyance but concern. Outside, the steppe grew more restless. The wind picked up steadily each night, sweeping across the barren plains with a force that rattled the loose siding of the older structures. The antennas rotated with a sluggish creak, as if resisting the turns they had made thousands of times before. Some nights, the generator building emitted a low, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the ground, subtle enough that no one mentioned it, yet unmistakable when felt underfoot. The cosmonaut found himself standing outside at odd hours, listening to the shifting sounds of the compound, the groan of metal cooling, the soft clatter of loose wires, the distant clank of an unlatched door tapping in the wind. These noises had always been present, but never before had they arranged themselves into patterns that suggested not mechanical function but a kind of atmospheric heaviness, a premonition of structural fatigue not measured in stress calculations but in silence and tension. Conversations among personnel grew increasingly fragmented. People still greeted one another with the expected courtesy, but their voices seemed to hover in the air for a moment longer than usual before fading, as if the space between them absorbed words reluctantly. In the dining hall, men spoke in short, clipped exchanges that ended abruptly whenever someone else approached. At one table, 2 engineers whispered intensely, their heads angled close together. When the cosmonaut sat down nearby, they immediately shifted to discussing unimportant details about supply inventories, their tones too light, their smiles too thin. Even the military supervisors, normally unshakable in their steely composure, now stood slightly more rigidly, as if bracing against something they could feel but not name. One officer walked past the cosmonaut with a stack of folders, each marked with different classification stamps, and the cosmonaut caught a glimpse of a page containing contradictory mission dates before the officer shut the folder and tightened his grip. By the end of each day, the cosmonaut felt a dull pressure building behind his thoughts, not panic but an accumulation of discrepancies that refused to settle into meaning. He began to question whether the mission itself contained some unspoken element, a temporal risk, perhaps, or an experimental parameter not included in the official briefings. The idea was absurd, yet the behavior of those around him suggested that they, too, sensed a fracture forming beneath the surface of routine. Something in the facility's rhythm had begun to stretch, like a cable pulled too tight, and though it had not yet snapped, the tension radiated through every floorboard, every fluorescent light, every recorded timestamp that didn't quite match the one before it. Each evening he stood outdoors, watching the sky darken above the flat horizon of the steppe, the cold air pressing against his face with a clarity that bordered on empty. The stars appeared sharp and indifferent, scattered across a vastness that neither confirmed nor denied the unease gathering below. The facility hummed quietly behind him, its towers and launch structures outlined against the dim glow of distant floodlights. And in that stillness, in the thick, expectant quiet between one gust of wind and the next, he felt the approaching contradiction like a faint but undeniable pulse, as though the future had already altered itself and was now sending its tremors backward through time. The shift from unease to full fracture did not occur in a single event, nor in any dramatic revelation, but in a gradual infiltration of contradictions that seeped into the Baikonur facility the way winter air seeps into old foundations, silently, persistently, with an intelligence that feels almost deliberate. The cosmonaut experienced the change first in the form of scattered documents, mission preparation notes with small red annotations he did not remember authorizing, fragments of transcripts that contained pauses and gaps where he was certain full sentences had once been recorded, and occasional replacement pages in briefing packets where the numbering subtly jumped, as if an intermediary sheet had been removed so precisely that even the binding bore no evidence. These details did not yet form a pattern, but they accumulated like grit in a gearbox, slowing the mental machinery of routine until every action required not only discipline but vigilance. Even breathing during training sessions felt heavier, as though the air inside the simulator contained a residue of something unspoken. Mixed within the daily procedures were fragments of personal writing, his own diary entries, perfectly in his handwriting, yet unfamiliar. One page contained a notation in the margin, 7 hours confirmed. Do not acknowledge the alternative. The cosmonaut stared at the words for several minutes, unable to recall writing them, the pencil strokes so identical to his own that he began to doubt the reliability of his memory. Another entry, dated 2 weeks earlier than it should have been, referenced a briefing that had not yet occurred, summarizing it in terse, clipped language, telemetry loops inconsistent. Mission Control advised silence. Possible temporal differential, unverified. He closed the notebook and placed it back in his locker, but the sentences continued to echo in the quiet space behind his thoughts, intertwining with the increasing strangeness unfolding around him. Mission Control transcripts began to reflect the tension. At first, the inconsistencies appeared trivial. A technician responding to a question that had not been asked yet, a controller giving a timestamp that did not correspond to the recorded time on the console screen. But as the anomalies multiplied, the transcripts acquired a fragmented, almost haunted quality. One excerpt, found in a stack of routine communications, read, 14 hours 2 minutes and 17 seconds, CMDR, confirm pressure stabilization. 14 hours 2 minutes and 19 seconds, Control 3, stabilized at previous reading. 14 hours 2 minutes and 19 seconds. Control 4, no, corrected value logged at 14:01. 14 hours 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Control 3, that wasn't the corrected value. 14 hours 2 minutes and 24 seconds. Control 1, maintain silence. Continue with primary sequence. The cosmonaut read this exchange several times, troubled not by the disagreement but by the instruction to remain silent, an instruction that, according to the official procedural doctrine, should never appear in routine pre-mission simulation logs. When he approached one of the controllers privately to ask about it, the man's face tightened, his jaw shifting with almost mechanical restraint. He replied that training sequences occasionally contained experimental communication structures designed to test personnel under stress. But the explanation felt hollow, the phrasing too precise, too polished, as if recited from a prepared justification rather than spoken from actual understanding. Weather changes amplified the tension. The nights grew unnaturally long, the horizon remaining a dull steel blue for extended periods before the sun reluctantly rose. Winds carried dust that moved in dense sheets across the ground, coating windows with a thin, grey film that resembled ash more than earth. During one late evening walk between the barracks and the administrative building, the cosmonaut paused as a gust of wind swept a swirl of dust up against a metal storage shed. The particles struck the surface with soft, rapid impacts that sounded almost like whispering, not human, but textured, as if the step itself were attempting to speak through the vibration of sand against steel. When the cosmonaut placed his hand on the shed, he felt a faint tremor beneath the metal, too rhythmic to be wind, too subtle to be machinery. Buildings aged visibly during those weeks. Corridors that had once felt merely utilitarian now appeared brittle, their paint peeling in new patterns that formed the shapes of branching cracks. The air inside the structures grew colder not only at night but even during midday, and several rooms developed persistent drafts despite being deep within the facility, with no windows or ventilation shafts that could explain the airflow. The control rooms, once brightly lit with fluorescent steadiness, now took several seconds to reach full illumination after the switches were thrown, the lights flickering with slow, deliberate pulses as if warming themselves against an approaching winter. Bureaucratic behaviors shifted in parallel. Files were sealed prematurely, stamped with classifications above the standard level for mission preparation. A clerk quietly removed a folder from an archive drawer the moment the cosmonaut approached, offering a strained smile and claiming that the materials had been reassigned for review. Reports once circulated openly now passed only between select hands, and even then, many pages came with thick black redactions that obscured more than half their content. Behind closed doors, voices became softer, more measured, punctuated by abrupt silences whenever footsteps approached. Secondary personnel displayed contradictory motives. Lieutenant Pavlov, one of the military supervisors, grew protective to the point of interference, intercepting the cosmonaut in hallways to offer vague advice. Not everything written reflects what occurred. Trust what you lived. His eyes bore a fatigue that had not been present earlier, a heaviness that suggested internal conflict. In contrast, Senior Engineer Chernov grew increasingly evasive, deflecting questions about telemetry, experimental modules, and the new biosensor arrays installed in the suit. His ambition seemed to swell through the cracks of protocol, his gaze sharp, calculating, but guarded, as though he were balancing two separate truths in parallel and had decided which one would benefit his career. The medical staff seemed divided as well. One doctor, clearly disturbed by recent data, insisted on performing additional examinations, his tone edged with urgency he attempted to hide. Another doctor dismissed these concerns entirely, claiming the readings were merely atmospheric artifacts. Yet the reports themselves contain numbers too precise to be accidental, heart rate fluctuations occurring in patterns that matched no known physiological rhythm, subdermal temperature variations that oscillated in fractions of seconds, and neurological readings whose timestamps did not align with the sequence of the recorded test. The cosmonaut noticed that one report included a handwritten note. Reading corresponds to T plus 11 months, not T plus 7 hours. The note had been hastily crossed out, but enough remained visible to confirm the words. The cosmonaut's own memory began to fissure. At first, the gaps appeared small, forgetting whether he had eaten breakfast, misremembering the order of conversations. But soon the inconsistencies deepened. He recalled speaking to a technician about recalibrating a guidance system, only to discover the conversation recorded in the mission notes occurred 3 days earlier than he remembered. He vividly remembered lying in the infirmary for a routine physical, yet the medical logs showed no entry for that date. His dreams grew more fragmented, layered with impressions that blended training sequences with something else, something that felt like lived experience but not contained within any day he could name. In one dream, he floated weightlessly in a capsule illuminated by an unfamiliar constellation. In another, he attempted to describe this to mission control, but the voices in the headset responded with strange delays, as though traveling across a gulf wider than orbit. Everywhere around him, the signs accumulated. A vibration in the walls of the communications building, steady and low, perceptible only when standing alone in the far corner near the outdated consoles. A mismatch in the oxygen readings during a pre-flight test that was corrected before he could question it. A technician dropping a tool upon seeing his face, as if startled by something he could not articulate. Even the animals in the steppe seemed altered. Fewer birds, longer periods of silence at dawn, the distant howling of stray dogs echoing with unusual sharpness. Then came the logs. One evening, a control room clerk accidentally handed him a packet of telemetry printouts intended for internal review only. The top pages contained routine data, but buried deeper were sequences of numbers impossible to interpret within standard orbital mechanics. The timestamps repeated themselves in mirrored intervals. Altitude readings fluctuated rapidly within the same second. Temperature readings from the life support module grew colder during periods where the capsule should have been in direct sunlight. The final page chilled him, a simple handwritten line at the bottom margin. He returned, but not from 7 hours. His breath stalled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition that every anomaly, every whisper, every fragment of rewritten data pointed toward a truth no one would openly admit. Something had already happened, or was already happening, and the facility was preparing for impact. The cosmonaut began to perceive the subtle contradictions not only in the records and observations of others but within himself. Memories of conversations he had with mission control operators blurred with recollections of events that the official documents could not confirm, or worse, actively denied. He would recall standing in the simulator, feeling the weight of zero-gravity training chute against his shoulders, while the logs indicated that at the same time he had been undergoing medical evaluation. Each dissonance carved a small hollow inside him, a place where certainty once resided. When he tried to discuss these fragments with a subordinate engineer, the man avoided eye contact and muttered something about experimental stress protocols, his voice devoid of conviction. In that moment, the cosmonaut realized that everyone around him had learned to navigate the contradictions with the same silent precision he had begun to practice, acknowledging only what was required, omitting what could not be explained, and carrying the weight of uncertainty as a matter of professional survival. In the living spaces, the cosmonaut noticed the same fractures. The barrack smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and unwashed linens, as always, but the odors now carried a sharper edge, an almost metallic tang that seemed to seep into the fabric of the room. Floorboards creaked under his boots in patterns that did not match the steps he took, as though the building itself remembered differently than he did. Small details, a chair knocked slightly askew, a discarded glove in a corner, A window latch left open against the draft created a persistent feeling of misalignment between perception and reality. The staff moved through these spaces with a similar care, their gestures tight and deliberate, eyes flicking toward corners or gaps as though anticipating disturbances in the ordinary flow of time. In the cafeteria, a technician paused mid-sentence, glanced at a printed schedule on the wall, and corrected a remark that had seemed innocuous moments before. Each action, each hesitation, became a subtle marker of the growing instability that surrounded them all. The step itself, outside the confines of the facility, appeared more hostile with every passing day. Winds tore across the plains, lifting dust and small pebbles into thin, slicing arcs. Night stretched with unnatural length, the horizon holding a cold, silvery light long after any expected dawn. Animals were sparse, their cries sharp and isolated, carried over the distance with an eerie clarity. Even the distant line of low hills seemed to shift imperceptibly from day to day, forming angles that suggested movement, or perhaps memory misaligned with expectation. The cosmonaut found himself lingering at the edges of the compound, watching these changes in silence, the air biting through his clothing, listening to the whispering of the wind as if it carried messages encoded in the static dust. Within the facility, bureaucratic behaviors became increasingly opaque. Reports once circulated for signature now disappeared into drawers that remained locked for days. Files were occasionally resealed, stamped with revised clearance levels without explanation. Clerks handled sensitive documents with a strange deliberation, as if aware that each touch might alter the fragile equilibrium of hidden timelines. Conversations occurred in low tones behind closed doors, voices carefully modulated to prevent anyone outside from detecting even the faintest emphasis. When the cosmonaut attempted to ask questions, he was met with brief, practiced deflections, statements framed in procedural language that offered no real answers but conveyed that certain truths were forbidden from discussion. He began to understand that the facility itself had become an organism operating under dual logics, carrying out the public sequence of events while silently preserving the unacknowledged alternative. The cosmonaut's personal reflection deepened the tension. He found himself tracing the sequence of events in his own memory, comparing it against logs and charts, and each attempt revealed more gaps than it filled. He would recall reaching for a tool in the simulator only to discover that telemetry indicated a different operator had handled it at the same time. He would remember a conversation with a medical officer and later find the exchange had been recorded with a different context, words reordered, implications shifted. His own internal timeline began to fragment, each segment carrying the weight of a different reality. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams repeated episodes he had lived, yet altered in minute ways, a console display slightly different, a colleague's gesture faintly delayed, a door opening in the opposite direction. Upon waking, these alterations pressed upon him with the weight of authenticity, blurring the boundaries between what he had experienced and what had been recorded. Even the secondary characters showed fractures in their motives. Lieutenant Pavlov, who had once conveyed a protective oversight, now oscillated between caution and cryptic hints, warning the cosmonaut with indirect references to procedures and silent nods toward sensitive files. Engineer Chernov, whose ambition had been tightly contained, now displayed subtle manipulations in the flow of information, redirecting questions, suggesting minor corrections, and at times allowing the cosmonaut to glimpse anomalies without context, as if testing his response. The medical staff's alignment fractured as well. One officer meticulously documented inconsistencies while another dismissed similar observations outright, creating an unspoken tension that the cosmonaut could feel in the subtle difference between measured notes and hurriedly scribbled additions. The entire facility became a web of partial truths, competing narratives, and cautious concealments, each participant performing a role while carrying private knowledge that could not be disclosed. Weather and structural decay mirrored these tensions. Metal frames groaned under temperature fluctuations, the echoes resonating in long corridors empty of sound, save for the occasional echo of boots or the faint movement of machinery. Dust and sand infiltrated every corner, coating instruments, creating a thin layer that reduced friction in certain mechanisms and altered readings slightly, enough to contribute to doubt. Night fell slowly and heavily, the horizon stretching with a muted, grey-blue light that refused resolution. In these hours, even the smallest discrepancies became magnified. A console reading that failed to match the expected parameters, a door left ajar against the draft, the briefest cough or footstep in an otherwise silent room. The cosmonaut moved through these spaces with increasing caution, attuned to the tension in the air, the almost imperceptible vibration of the walls, and the subtle hesitation in the movements of those around him. The culmination of anomalies approached gradually. Data misalignments coalesced into an almost tangible presence in the archives, where logs, reports, and medical notes intersected and contradicted one another with precise, mathematical consistency. A simple comparison revealed the impossibility. The same time period accounted for 7 hours in one set of records and 11 months in another, both documented with procedural accuracy. Attempts to reconcile the discrepancy within the confines of standard logic produced no resolution. The numbers did not admit to explanation. The cosmonaut felt an ineffable dissonance in his own body, his heartbeat, respiration, neurological rhythms, as if physiological reality itself had been stretched along the twin tracks of time he had been forced to inhabit. Each measurement confirmed the impossible, yet each result was recorded without embellishment, treated as a simple, undeniable fact. The cool detachment of the documentation intensified the psychological weight. Each sheet of paper, each printed graph, each silent correction serving as a small hammer striking the mind. By the time he stood alone in the late evening control room, the weight of fragmented realities pressed upon him fully. The instruments hummed steadily, the lights flickered in slow pulses, and the faint vibrations of the facility under the wind made the air feel solid, almost oppressive. He traced the sequence of events in his mind, reconstructing fragments of conversations, procedural notes, and internal recollections, each overlaying the other, forming a lattice of time impossible to traverse without fracturing perception. The dual timelines existed simultaneously, as tangible and undeniable as the floor beneath his boots, yet mutually exclusive. The anomalies in biological readings, mismatched telemetry logs, and his own fractured memories now converged, forming the first unmistakable contours of the central discovery. The cosmonaut had lived 2 durations in one body, experienced events that could not coexist, and returned to a world that demanded a single, false coherence. And still, outwardly, the facility functioned. Clerks sorted files, operators checked equipment, supervisors walked corridors with rigid postures, technicians handled delicate instruments with precise caution. Everything adhered to protocol, yet beneath the surface, the hum of unease grew steadily, a quiet resonance threading through walls, floors, and air ducts, amplifying the weight of what could not be spoken. The cosmonaut realized that the revelation existed in layers, documented, undeniable, yet carefully shielded. It would be logged, analyzed, referenced in closed reports, but never acknowledged in conversation beyond the limits of necessity. The moral weight of this truth, the impossibility of reconciling lived experience with official records, was carried silently by everyone involved, shaping gestures, eyes, and pauses as much as the instruments themselves. In the end, the approach to the central discovery was not dramatic, not marked by alarms or sudden interruptions, but by the steady, undeniable accumulation of evidence that converged upon him like the slow weight of gravity. It could not be ignored, yet it could not be altered. The cosmonaut sensed its inevitability, the certainty of its existence pressing down through every corridor, across every shadowed wall, into every silent conversation. He understood fully that he now occupied the space between two realities, each documented, each measured, each true, and that the facility, the system, the people, the machinery, had learned to carry the contradiction as a matter of course. The vibration of anomaly hummed behind every surface, a resonance impossible to escape, unavoidable, and immutable, as though time itself had been secretly rewritten and he alone remained conscious of the alteration. The revelation did not erupt. It settled, slowly and heavily, the way sediment drifts to the bottom of a sealed tank, forming a layer that cannot be removed no matter how the water above it stirs. It began with the biological markers, those small numbers captured by machines that do not dream, do not speculate, do not care. The medical team laid the sheets across a stainless table, the paper edges trembling slightly in the draft that always leaked under the infirmary door. The cosmonaut looked at the columns of data and felt an immediate, silent wrongness. His cells told a story incompatible with 7 hours of absence. Proteins degraded at rates associated with nearly a year of cosmic exposure. Trace radiation signatures recorded in his marrow corresponded to long-term orbital patterns rather than a short demonstration flight. His neurological patterns, taken during the first hour after landing, displayed rhythms that matched neither waking nor exhaustion but a hybrid category usually seen in cases of prolonged sensory displacement. Even the tiny scars on his knuckles, ones he thought he knew the origin of, were recorded as having healed through stages that required months. The doctor standing beside him said little. He pointed to the graphs, then to the timestamps, and the silence that followed was the closest thing to a confession any of them could give. The mission logs deepened the fracture. In the dim archive room, beneath a light that flickered with the slow pulse of an old transformer, the cosmonaut watched two sets of documents placed side by side. One set described a routine experimental orbit lasting 7 hours. The other set, sealed under a higher clearance level, outlined a sequence of telemetry consistent with an 11-month orbital presence. The two documents were structured with identical precision, written in the same institutional language, stamped by the same authorities, yet they described two mutually exclusive realities. The archivist who presented them spoke in a low voice, careful, cautious, as if the walls themselves demanded restraint. It was not fear that shaped his tone, but the weight of a system that had forced him to carry these contradictions alone. He explained that the second set of logs had existed for months, updated regularly, as if someone believed the cosmonaut was still in orbit even after he had already been declared returned. The numbers marched across the page with a calm, mechanical certainty: orbital altitude adjustments, pressure fluctuations, solar panel output, life support diagnostics. The timeline extended far beyond the cosmonaut's recorded landing. The final entry, dated only weeks before the present moment, noted that the pilot's vital signs had reached a pattern of critical anomaly. Yet the man responsible for those signals now stood alive in the dim room, breathing the same dry air as the clerk. The confrontation did not require raised voices. It unfolded in the small control room where the old green lamps hummed against the heavy silence. Senior staff members gathered, their posture rigid, their faces shadowed in a way that made their features appear carved rather than alive. The cosmonaut spoke first, not with accusation but with a kind of exhausted clarity, describing the fractures in his memory, the stretches of blankness that felt too wide, the dreams that carried the weight of lived experience, the persistent sense of having been alone far longer than 7 hours. His words did not echo. They seemed to hang in the air like dust motes suspended in a beam of light, visible yet untouchable. The supervisors exchanged glances that lasted only a fraction of a second, but within those fleeting looks lay the admission no one dared speak. They, too, had felt the pull of the anomaly through the numbers, the equipment failures, the unusual caution with which certain technicians handled the sealed data, the internal directives instructing them to avoid certain topics. Psychological strain wound itself around the room like wire. One controller appeared on the verge of speaking but stopped, pressing his lips into a thin line. The medical officer adjusted his glasses repeatedly, an unconscious gesture that betrayed the tremor in his fingers. The archivist stared at a spot on the floor, as if bracing for the impact of a truth he had already accepted. The cosmonaut felt something loosen inside himself, not relief, not fear, but a widening hollow where certainty once lived. He asked the only question that mattered: how long they believed he had truly been gone. The supervisor closest to him replied with a carefully measured sentence that sounded brittle under the weight of its own restraint. He said that the official position remained unchanged. 7 hours. No deviación. But his eyes betrayed him, darting downward for the briefest moment toward a classified folder resting on the table. Inside it lay the alternative timeline, the version the institution carried in its deepest records, the one aligned with the biological evidence. The internal collapse came quietly. The cosmonaut felt time divide into segments that no longer aligned: the mission he remembered, the mission that the documents described, and the silent expanse his mind could sense but not access. The fracture manifested not as panic but as a slow, spreading acknowledgement that he contained two durations of existence, one superimposed on the other. His hands trembled when he looked at them, as if the skin remembered something he did not. He felt as though he had walked out of 2 different years into the same room, the layers of experience rubbing against each other like plates of fractured metal. The realization did not arrive as revelation but as recognition, the unsettling certainty that the discrepancy was not a mistake, not a glitch, but a recorded fact. The staff's reactions completed the revelation. Pavlov stood in the doorway, his protective stance now drained of authority, replaced with a kind of defeated clarity. He admitted, in a voice so soft it barely carried, that internal memos had circulated weeks before the cosmonaut's return predicting an 11-month absence based on classified experimental projections. The medical officer confessed that some of the scans taken immediately after landing had been sealed without review. The engineer, usually evasive, now appeared stripped of his ambition, his words halting as he revealed that certain modules on the capsule had been installed without full disclosure to most personnel. The archivist finally spoke with the steadiness of a man who had lived too long beside a truth he could not voice, that the logs had never contradicted themselves. There had always been 2 timelines, both developing with perfect internal logic, shadowing each other like parallel tracks laid only a hair-width apart. The discovery settled on the room with an almost physical weight. The cosmonaut was 2 realities collapsed into one body. The facility had documented both. The contradiction was not an error. It was the result. The truth existed not as a single line but as a double trajectory, and the institution, unable to reconcile them, had chosen silence. Outside, the wind pressed against the metal walls with a long, steady pressure, as though the step itself leaned in to witness the moment. The lights hummed, flickered once, then stabilized. No one raised their voice. No one offered comfort. The revelation did not shatter anything. It merely exposed what had already been broken. After the central discovery settled over the facility like a shadow that could not be lifted, life at Baikonur continued outwardly as before, yet beneath the veneer of routine the world had shifted irreversibly. The cosmonaut moved through the same corridors, entered the same control rooms, touched the same cold metal surfaces, but everything felt heavier, slower, weighted with a knowledge that no one dared speak aloud. Supervisors paced with the same rigid posture, yet their steps echoed differently, sharper, more measured, as if the vibration of unease had become embedded in their muscles. Technicians touched consoles with precise, deliberate care, aware that even the smallest movement could betray something beyond protocol. The wind outside blew in long, sharp gusts across the barren steppe, carrying the dust that layered the compound in a muted grey ash, a constant reminder of both impermanence and the slow erosion of certainty. Nights lingered, the horizon stretched in an unnatural steel hue, and the distant hills seemed to shift subtly with each passing hour. The cosmonaut, walking alone at the edge of the compound, felt the emptiness press against him, a silence composed of both wind and absence, the weight of time as both ally and oppressor. Conversations became rarer, thinner, weighted with caution. In the mess hall, men no longer raised voices except for the barest necessities of coordination. Their movements were economical, precise, almost mechanical. A technician once prone to joviality now sat in silence, staring at the table as if the dust on its surface contained a secret coded only for his perception. Supervisors exchanged minimal information, gestures clipped and eyes quick to avert contact, leaving the cosmonaut to navigate a network of half-smiles, slight nods, and careful phrasing. Some corridors became paths no one chose to traverse except when essential, the fluorescent lights flickering longer in their attempt to illuminate, as though even illumination resisted the exposure of truth's best left unspoken. The cosmonaut noticed it most in the archive rooms. Documents once accessible with effort now vanished from view, locked within cabinets sealed under the highest classifications, rewritten, redacted, and restamped with an urgency that carried no explanation. Each folder, each sheet of paper, became a weight in the hands of those entrusted to carry them, and yet none spoke of the anomaly in any conversation. Rumors circulated like ghosts, faint and insistent. The cosmonaut became an object of quiet speculation, some whispering that he had been part of an experiment beyond comprehension, others claiming he had touched some secret boundary of time itself. The truth, whatever its form, was refracted through the lens of fear and bureaucracy. Medical staff continued routine tests, but their hands trembled just slightly when touching his instruments. Engineers inspected systems with meticulous care, noting anomalies with pencil marks that were quickly erased. Mission logs were filled with entries carefully phrased, stating what must have occurred rather than what could be confirmed, leaving gaps that were as telling as they were frustrating. The cosmonaut found that each interaction, each look, each hesitant pause carried more information than any official document, yet the knowledge remained suspended, unspoken, codified in the subtle tension of human behavior rather than recorded in ink. Some personnel began to disappear, or at least to vanish from the cosmonaut's awareness. A clerk who had once managed sensitive files with exacting care was transferred to a distant base under the guise of a promotion. An engineer responsible for maintaining telemetry modules requested an indefinite leave, citing vague personal reasons. Medical officers were reassigned quietly, without explanation, their names crossed out of schedules and their routines erased from daily operations. Those who remained adapted to the invisible weight, moving with a resigned precision that carried an almost ritual quality. The cosmonaut learned to read the subtle language of restraint, a lowered gaze, a brief hesitation before answering, a hand hovering over a folder without touching it, all part of the unspoken choreography of acknowledgement and omission. He became both participant and observer, cataloging not just anomalies in data, but anomalies in human behavior, the way every gesture and silence reflected the gravity of an event that could not be publicly reconciled. Even routine observations took on a spectral quality. A note slipped under his door one morning, unsigned, written in fine, careful script, referenced minor readings in the telemetry logs that he had not been aware of, noting subtle discrepancies in life support calibration and the rhythmic anomalies of his own biological records. It instructed him to maintain appearances, to follow protocol, and do not disturb the recorded timeline. In meetings, supervisors referred to him in clipped, formal tones, as though he were both present and absent, a living archive that must adhere to the duality of recorded and lived experience. Night after night, he walked the outer perimeter of the facility, listening to the wind pressing against antennae and metal walls, hearing the subtle groan of floors and supports under the weight of temperature changes, and felt the omnipresent tension of a system straining to contain a contradiction too vast to articulate. Fragments of reports and witness notes scattered across the facility's records reinforced the uneasy equilibrium. A line in a memo read simply, "Patient shows incongruent biological readings. Recommendation: observe in situ and maintain operational protocol." Another note, scribbled in a margin and later carefully erased, hinted at repeated simulations of orbital exposure longer than authorized. Subject exhibits signs of extended mission duration not officially sanctioned. Data logged and archived. In internal communications, supervisors referenced timelines and logs with coded language that implied knowledge without revealing it. The cosmonaut understood that these fragments, though inaccessible to the public and removed from standard records, formed a lattice of acknowledgement and containment, proof of both anomaly and suppression, a bureaucratic infrastructure built to record what could not be reconciled with official reality. Life adapted to the anomaly quietly. Operators avoided certain consoles at specific hours. Technicians moved cautiously around modules associated with the cosmonaut's measurements. Corridors that once were traversed freely became semi-forbidden zones, their passage limited to necessity. The cosmonaut's own routine shifted imperceptibly. He stopped gazing at the stars during late-night walks, sensing that the heavens no longer contained reliable coordinates. He ate quickly and mechanically, noting the measured time of each meal. He avoided initiating conversation unless required, becoming both participant in and subject of the system's silent observation. And yet, the presence of the anomaly remained, embedded not in dramatic events, but in the almost imperceptible fabric of every interaction, every shadowed hallway, every flicker of light. The final impression was one of unresolved inevitability. The wind continued to sweep the steppe, carrying dust and faint echoes of movement. The metal structures groaned under their own age and under the weight of secrets. The night stretched long and cold, grey light lingering in the sky with a neutrality that neither comforted nor informed. The cosmonaut walked through the space aware of his dual existence, aware that records and memories diverged, and that the truth existed only in fragments dispersed among classified pages, unread glances, and cautious gestures. The facility remained functional, yet every element of its operation, the careful redaction of documents, the low tones of communication, the deliberate avoidance of certain pathways, testified to the quiet power of what had been discovered, the anomaly embedded as both fact and taboo. In this stillness, the story reached its terminus not through resolution but through persistence. There was no dramatic conclusion, no statement of understanding, no attempt to reconcile timelines. Instead, there was observation, the cosmonaut cataloguing the shadows in the corridors, the temperature variations across floors, the trembling hands of medical officers, the redacted notations that glimmered faintly on sheets of paper like spectral residue. The facility itself became a record of containment, the people within it carriers of memory and restraint, and the cosmonaut both witness and subject, existing simultaneously within the measured time of 7 hours and the unacknowledged duration of 11 months. The system had endured, the anomaly had been recorded, and the truth remained suspended, cold, and immutable, leaving the observer, whether reader, participant, or future archivist, to confront the impossible and unresolved, to dwell in the quiet, ambiguous aftermath, uncertain whether the event was cover-up, scientific anomaly, or something beyond human comprehension.